Turn the sound on.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I would normally give you the 3, 2, 1 countdown. But,
Yeah.
but no, thank you for taking the time to meet with me today. Obviously, it's a privilege and an honor for me to represent Northeast Iowans in Congress, and I think it's a really, really important time to be there, standing up for Iowans' voices. Specifically, I serve on the Budget and Appropriations Committee. I'm the only Iowan on the Appropriations Committee right now, which I think has been incredibly important in standing up for a lot of priorities that I think otherwise might not have a very prominent voice there. When I ran for this job, I wanted to pledge several things. First was to be transparent and accessible to all of you and to the people of this district. It's why I'm here today. It's why I do town halls. It's why I do weekly press calls. It's important to me to make sure that I'm getting out there and answering people's questions and also giving people the context and perspective as to what's happening in Washington as well. I wanted to make sure that I was a strong voice for rural Iowans and rural America. As we've seen, a lot of the policies can sometimes center on big population centers, and so a lot of what I've tried to do is make sure that I'm reaching out on rural policy. Safety and security issues for Iowa families were a priority for me as well. I think, and I'll touch on that a little bit, but I think that's been a huge topic of conversation in our communities. And then, most importantly of all, I work for the taxpayers of the state of Iowa and this country, and so I wanted to make sure that I was being as judicious with their money as possible. That was the mandate that I had. So I also think it's important to note that I've really tried, and I tried to do this when I was a state representative, I'm doing it now, finding opportunities when possible to collaborate across the aisle, speaking up obviously on things that I don't agree with and I don't think are right for this district, but whenever possible finding those opportunities to work together. And we continue to do that and have some good opportunities to point to there. Specifically for Dubuque and Dubuque County, I think I wanted to just point out a few things that I think are real wins for what we've been able to accomplish, even serving in the minority party in Washington, D.C. First thing I think I'd point to is the Metropolitan Statistical Area challenges. Obviously, there was a proposal to change that threshold to 100,000, which would have shut Dubuque out. And we worked with the city and folks in the county because we know what that would have done, not only to potential federal resources, but economic development opportunities and just the impact to this area. So we went on offense right away. That was one of the first issues that I dealt with when I got to DC. Actively questioned the director of the Office of Management and Budget, Shalonda Young, about that, specifically saying, hey, here's what this would do to my community. We wrote letters to the administration. I co-sponsored legislation to say, hey, please don't do this to our communities. And then when they came into our Appropriations Committee hearing, specifically asked them about it. So they were coming up to us for funding, and I said, this is not good for my district. It's not good for a lot of these other communities, including Ames here in Iowa, obviously. So I think that's a real win that we were able to push back on that and get them to reverse course on that proposal. So that's one thing that I would just point to really quick off the top. Another thing, we worked with members of the city and also with Secretary Buttigieg on getting grant dollars to come into the Port of Dubuque to help with that infrastructure. I've been very adamant about targeted infrastructure spending, and I think that's a really huge thing for the Port of Dubuque when you look at getting products in and out, the lock and dam system and the port as well. I think that's a win.
We can unload big ships down there, so if you have any supply issues that you can ship through Dubuque, we can unload them here.
Gosh, well, and that's one of the, we've been talking a lot about that is, where are access points for supply chain? Do we need to be rethinking that also going forward? So I think that's a whole other discussion and a whole other issue, but I think it's obviously relevant right now because of the supply chain issues that we have been experiencing in this country. I would love to see more things come up the Mississippi, not just out of the Mississippi. But the other thing that I would point to here, we've been able to secure some funding in the appropriations bills that have so far passed the House. Obviously, they're still in limbo with the current situation, but I think that it's a win to be able to get those priorities included, including the Chaplain-Schmidt Trail funding, as well as the NESP funding for the river. I worked with Sherry Bustos on that to put in that community project funding request. Because when I talk about river health and the lock and dam system and how important that is, I think that was a really good place to show hey, like here you've got a Democrat on the other side of the aisle and the other side of the river, and we're both working together on that shared priority. So we've been working with her office on that. So I think my point in everything that we've been trying to do with, whether it was those community project funding requests, whether it's working with these departments to try to get those targeted investments, it's really about trying to get as many tax dollars back to Iowa as possible in a targeted way. And that's how I've tried to operate. I've also pushed back, and I think you are probably very aware of where I've pushed back on what I perceive to be wasteful spending. And we can talk a little bit more. I'm sure you have some questions about that as well. As far as safety and security, the situation at our southern border I see to be the biggest risk. I serve on the Homeland Security Appropriations Subcommittee, and we know that our investments at the border are not adequate for what's happening there. We need to have a safe and secure border, because without it, I think we can't bank on everything else in our lives, and safety and security is paramount to our families. MS-13, gang members, drug dealers, the human smuggling, all of those issues continue to run rampant at the border. Not to mention, we have a huge humanitarian crisis with the number of people that are coming across. It's simply unsustainable, and the Department of Homeland Security knows that, and they've admitted as such, but I've been putting forth solutions that I think will help stem that, and I know members of my conference have as well, and so we've been working together on that, trying to actually put forward some solutions, but we haven't heard a whole lot from this administration. That's why I've called for Secretary Mayorkas's resignation. I think we need new leadership in the Department of Homeland Security. And then ultimately, I think it's important when you talk about safety and security in our communities. I've tried to support our local law enforcement as much as possible. I attended the Dubuque National Night Out over the summer, and it was really a great opportunity to see truly our community engage with our local law enforcement. They're trying to change the narrative around that, even in some places where, and even in the halls of Congress, we have some people who continue to push the anti-police rhetoric, which I don't think is productive. I think there was a very clear response to that in terms of what happened in the elections last week, where it was on the ballot in some places, but I'm continuing to be strong on my support for local law enforcement. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about the rural and urban divide. Obviously in this country, we've seen that continue to grow. I want to make sure that opportunities exist for Iowans no matter where the zip code is, and I think that's become especially prevalent in the healthcare space, especially during the pandemic. So I think one of the things that I've tried to do is really support our federally qualified health centers, places like Crescent here in Dubuque. I visited there. I've also visited the Eastern Iowa Health Center in Cedar Rapids, and even submitted community project funding requests for our federally qualified health centers, as well as supporting legislation that will help with telehealth parity, because ultimately that's a whole area where they've seen a huge increase in untapped resource, and they have the desire to expand more into that space in the footprint that they serve. So I think when you talk about access to a lot of those things, they are maybe centralized here, but that access point can really, really spread wide if we give them the resources to do that. So again, have co-sponsored and supported legislation to help support them and continue to look for ways to make sure we're expanding that access. With that, I mean, I think really I'm looking forward to taking your questions today, but I just wanted to be very clear, like those priorities for me, we've tried to live that, whether it's out in Washington, D.C. or with our staff offices here in the district, because I know I'm in the business of customer service, much like you guys are too, so.
Great,
yeah.
thanks, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we'll get into some more specifics on some of those issues, but I guess I'd like to hear, we first met via Zoom conversation, and now you've got almost a year under your belt in Washington, and I think most people have an idea of what they think Congress is like, and it's probably not very accurate. So from your perspective, what surprised you about it? I guess good things or bad things? What was different than what you anticipated?
I think, just coming from the state perspective, the volume of legislation that's introduced obviously was much more than what we dealt with at the state legislature here. So just that strict volume of bills that are being introduced every day, that was obviously surprising and kind of shocking to me. You talk about, you have 435 representatives, each representing their district, and and I look at even the legislation that I've introduced, the dozens of bills that I've introduced and co-sponsored, and that I think was surprising to me. The other thing I think that's surprising to me is obviously in the news, and I come from the news business myself, and we hear about some hot topics consistently all the time, but there are so many other things that are moving that are really beneficial to the American people, and I think we try to talk a lot about those things, things that are really impacting our community on that ground level, because those are positives. In a time when it is kind of a toxic environment, it's a hyper-partisan environment, there are a lot of places where good work is happening together. Good example, I'm working with Sherry again on a bill to help with the driftless area. That's something that's not a partisan issue, but we want to make sure that we're working together on flooding priorities, and so we're going to be introducing a piece of legislation coming up to address some of that. Good example, mental health access for veterans. I worked with Cindy Axney on that bill, and that's actually been signed into law also. So those are a lot of examples where I was pleasantly surprised at the amount of collaboration that still does exist. It just doesn't get talked about very much.
Mm-hmm. And are there other issues where you feel like you haven't been able to get traction because of the being in the minority?
I wouldn't say necessarily not getting traction. I think ultimately, an appropriations is a good example of a committee where I think that there is a lot of collegiality that still exists on that committee. People in Washington, D.C. have said it's you have Democrats and Republicans, and then you have appropriators. There's this kind of different mentality in terms of how business is conducted there. So I think in terms of our priorities, I submitted 10 community project funding requests, and all 10 were included in the bills because there are a lot of shared priorities in what I submitted as well. So I think that obviously there are differences of opinion in spending, for example, and some social policy, but there are a lot of shared priorities that I think if we got back to talking more about those, we might be able to even make some more progress.
Mm-hmm. And of course, the very beginning, you came in January 6th. We all, heard your words, and it was very compelling to hear you talk about what that day was like for you, and sounded like a very scary situation. And I guess, how do you sort of reconcile that with where we are today, and you're not being interested in, furthering the investigation?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm not interested in furthering the investigation. I think it's how that investigation is done that I have had the disagreement with. I was actually one of a few dozen who co-sponsored a bill that would have created a bipartisan commission back in January, right after that happened. And I still believe that we need to get those answers. And it was a terrible day. And, I lived it myself. I had FaceTime my kids to say, hey, by the way, mommy's locked in her office and it's scary, and my husband's watching it all unfold on TV, right? And there's not a whole lot he could do, but I want to be very clear. I think anybody who broke the law that day should be held accountable, regardless of who they are. I also think that getting answers needs to be done in a fair and equitable way, not a highly partisan and political way, which is what we're seeing happen with the current commission. There was no boundary in terms of congressional, I would call it interference, because ultimately a lot of these departments are doing their job. We've seen hundreds of people, I think the number's maybe approaching 600 now, if not above 600, who've been arrested and held accountable for breaking the law that day. And I know that those departments, Department of Justice, Capitol Police, Metropolitan Police, all of those agencies are continuing their investigations, and I think we need to make sure that people are held accountable, but I also wanted to see it happen in a way that wasn't hyper-partisan.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. We can probably just kind of go around.
Well, now that we're talking about January 6th, what are your thoughts on kind of the underlying, lies that were pushed that kind of led to that? What are your thoughts on last year's election and some of the rhetoric that's been spread since then by now former President Trump, and there are elected leaders across this country who continue to kind of feed into the conspiracy theories and such. What's your take on how the election played out last year and what people should feel about our process, how our elections are conducted.
Well, I hear a lot about election integrity when I'm out in the district, whether it's at my town halls or feedback coming into our office, and I made it very clear, that's why I supported the certification of the election, that I believe that outcome was the outcome of the election,
Sure.
and that President Biden was the president. That said, I also want to make sure that, going forward, we have good election integrity policies in place, so that there are no questions, because ultimately, the number one thing that I've heard from constituents in the district is they want to have faith in our election system, and there are people who fundamentally do believe that their vote didn't count for whatever reason that may be. So ultimately, what I've tried to do is say, okay, well, let's look at Iowa, for example. We do it right here in Iowa, and I've been very clear about that. I think my job as the elected representative for this district is to make sure Iowans know that the vote that they're casting is counting, and our election process is transparent and legitimate. I worked with Congressman Rodney Davis, for example. He came to the district, and we went to Benton County's auditor's office, peeled back the curtains for people so that they can see process from start to finish. And actually, the Benton County auditor, when I talked with her, I said, you should probably show Iowans what you do, so that people who might have questions can see, here's what the process actually is like from start to finish. Because legislators, we put into place, the requirements, obviously, but the auditors are truly implementing that from the ground up. So we were able to, talk with them about, okay, here's where the ballot comes in from. Literally the FedEx guy was delivering the ballots for the local elections the day we were there. So we literally saw the ballots come in all the way to the machines where they store them, the safety devices so that they are anti-tamper, everything. And so we tried to make sure we were showing that integrity to our constituents here in Iowa, because that is my role. I think that people want to make sure that there are common sense provisions in place to make sure that integrity exists, things like voter ID, which I've heard from a lot of people they still want here in Iowa. And we are seeing pushes nationally to eliminate those provisions. You talk about undermining integrity in elections, it's bills like H.R. 1 and H.R. 4 that I believe do that. You look at some of the provisions that would federalize our elections, that's the quickest way to, in my mind, erase a lot of the gains we've made for integrity here in Iowa. What works in Alaska doesn't work in Iowa, what works in New York doesn't work in Iowa, and states should have purview over their elections.
So staying on the theme of elections, much is made every 4 years about the Iowa caucuses.
Mm-hmm.
First in the nation, brings a lot of notoriety to our state. And we've had our challenges with caucus results here, especially this last go around. And I know there's movement to bump Iowa out of that #1 position again. Mm-hmm. And should Iowa remain a caucus state, or should it be a primary? And I'm just curious your feelings on that.
Yeah. I think we should remain first in the nation, because we have a system here that works to vet candidates. I've said this time and time again, I'm out there taking town hall questions, tough questions from constituents, and Iowans know how to put a candidate through that vetting process. And I think there's nothing quite like it and I'll give the example of President Biden was sitting in someone's basement having a beer with him watching a basketball game last year, and now he's in the White House, right? So ultimately, we have a system in place where it is close to the people, and I think the rest of the country obviously saw maybe what happened with the reporting and the Democrat results that night, and there were some questions. My understanding is a lot of that has been worked out. I know Jeff Kaufman has been, as our party chair, has been very, very active with the RNC to continue lobbying for Iowa's first in the nation status, and I'm confident that we will continue to be first in the nation. And I think we should be, because we know how to put candidates through the ringer in the right way to make sure they're vetted.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I guess when you're out, when you're out speaking to constituents, I wonder, regarding the last election and things, there are clearly some alternative news outlets and things online that are continually putting more and more, questions about the election results out there. And I wonder if you hear from constituents who are watching and listening to those sources and believing them. Do you hear from people who believe what they're being told from those sources without any substantiation. I mean, I wonder. Those.
Yeah,
I
and
mean,
how would you respond to it?
I would
Yeah.
just say, look, my goal is to make sure that I tell people about what happened here in Iowa, and I believe we've run a really, really good election process here in Iowa. If other state legislatures feel like they need to take action on it, then they do, and it's up to those residents of those states to be able to say to their elected officials, I want to see changes in this process because I have heard this, this, or this. And that's how it should work, right? I mean, people calling our office, if they have questions, I, again, say, look at how we do it here in Iowa. These are the kinds of policies that I support and I push for as far as election integrity is concerned. So that's, again, why I don't want a Department of Justice take over for how every change in election law that Iowa makes, it shouldn't have to get a clearance from the Department of Justice. I mean, that's the kind of policy we're talking about in terms of changes that Democrats are proposing right now. So that's my constituents. I'm focused on making sure that they understand that I'm doing everything I can to stand up for the right integrity for elections, and that's what my role is. Next.
Yeah.
Yeah, my question's on, it's close to home, but also important to our communities, and that's on the role of newspapers and newsrooms. And as you probably know, you're a former journalist, and
Yep.
so, newspapers in particular have lost about 57% of their newsroom staff since the recession in 2008. And many newspapers have either combined or folded over the last 10, 15 years. And my question is, how familiar are you? Our company even has had to close and discontinue a newspaper publication in your district or in your potential new district here in Marion and down in Johnson County. And
Marion Independent, was it the?
Times.
Marion Times, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, my question is, how familiar are you with the Local Journalism Sustainability Act? It was it's HR 3940. I know it's got 63 co-sponsors, including over a dozen Republicans. And so, just how familiar are you with it? And do
I'm
you support
not,
it?
but I would absolutely flag it, and we'll take a look at it. The first thing I said today was how many thousands of pieces of legislation are introduced, and so happy to take a look at it.
Okay. I did forward a number of documents and had a conference call with Zach Detheridge back in
Okay.
early July, along
Okay.
with our local Chamber of Commerce, and forwarded him a bunch of materials.
Okay,
Did not hear back from him, but
okay,
I guess we would hope that you would support that. If, just briefly, it supports tax credits for people for subscriptions for advertising and for journalism positions.
Okay.
And I think it's in one of the bills. But if you're not familiar with it, I mean, we certainly can help make you more familiar with it.
Yeah.
Beyond Zach.
absolutely, and I'll follow up with him too, and not everything, gets communicated as far as the quantity of bills that are coming through, so happy to follow up with him as well on the bill.
I'm going to kind of reach back into something that you talked about in your little introduction there at the beginning.
Yeah.
You talked quite a bit about border security and safety, and I just wanted to know how that ties into Iowa right now. You said specifically that you had solutions to that. What are those solutions, and how does that kind of tie back into our communities, specifically here in northeastern Iowa?
I want to start off with a story because I actually drove up to meet with a family in Black Hawk County, and you may have seen the story recently about the Be Gone Act that I just co-introduced with Senator Ernst. There was a young woman who was assaulted by an illegal immigrant in this country, and she was 16 years old and babysitting, a 2-year-old, and I don't want that to happen to any family, and that's why I believe border security matters, because it does affect our community. And it comes down to, I did a ride-along with a Cedar Rapids police officer last year, and we had an illegal immigrant who was being violent and actually tried to assault an officer when he was being arrested. Those are the kinds of issues that I do think matter in terms of the actual impact in our community. I've talked with our local sheriffs, both Democrats and Republicans, about the drug impact to our communities. And when I mentioned it's MS-13 gang members, it's it's the cartels who are winning, that pipeline comes into Iowa. And so it does create problems for our state as well. The reason I also think we need to know, we need to secure our border is because right now, our Customs and Border Patrol and our ICE agents can't properly communicate to track people once they're released into this country. And we know thousands of people are being released without a notice to appear. So if we don't have the proper resources to secure and then vet people before they come in, we don't know where they're going and what they're doing here, which is a concern for our communities. So when I talk about fixing the solutions I see at the border, the Remain in Mexico policy which this administration is fighting, and it was working. It was helping to stem that tide at the border. We need to make sure we're giving our Customs and Border Patrol agents the resources that they need. These proposed budgets have reduced the resources that would go to these agents. We've seen a systematic approach of, through memos, basically, of enforcement, selective non-enforcement of our immigration laws, as they are right now. So enforcing those laws would enable us to deport bad people from our countries and then also keep our communities safer. So I see it as a comprehensive list of those solutions. We need to secure our border first and foremost. We need to make sure our agencies can actually communicate to track people once they're here. And then I also think we need to talk about legal immigration reform, because that's an area I campaigned on as well. And I've supported policy through the Appropriations Committee to help with work visas, for example. We need to be incentivizing legal immigration and disincentivizing illegal immigration. So those are the policies that I've been specifically working on and supporting. But I believe it comes down to accountability, and the fact that we're having to rely on media leaks for information about the numbers of people coming into our country illegally. I think that's a clear failure of the administration.
Do you have data that would show that illegal immigrants in Iowa are committing crimes at a greater rate than the general populace?
I don't know about specific rates of crime, but I would say I can point to specific examples that people in our communities say that's too many, right? And ultimately, and I understand people who live here commit crimes too, and I get that, but this is an issue that is, in my mind, magnifying, and the numbers don't lie when you see how many are crossing at the border. We're at over 1.2 million already this year. We're on track to go higher than that. It's more people than the entire state of Montana have come into this country illegally, and we just need to make sure we're providing services to the people who live here, because if we have all these strains on our resources with additional people, I mean, that's the taxpayers of this country who are footing those bills, whether it's the law enforcement in our communities, whether it's schools, whether it's healthcare. Those are all places that our taxpayers are spending their hard-earned money and their paychecks on. And I think that's where the biggest concern I have is not only safety and security, but its resources also.
Something, changing gears here a little bit, something that obviously was getting a lot of attention recently was the redistricting process in the state of Iowa. And Republicans did support the second set of maps, and the governor signed them, and we're set. So now we have situations where someone like you have already indicated you want to run again for re-election. So you have a district you serve and a district you're seeking to serve, and they're not exactly the same.
Mostly the same. Though.
Mostly.
90% of the people in the new district that I am going to run in, I currently represent.
Sure. I was just kind of curious, what's the approach on kind of the outliers? I mean, how do you balance, folks that you don't yet represent but you seek to, and the folks that you represent now that come 2022, no.
Yeah.
The next election, you might not. I'm just kind of curious how. That's kind of a curveball that.
I don't see it that way though. I see it as I've completed my third 20-county tour for this district, and I'm on my fourth right now, and I'll complete that by the end of the year. I'm getting to all 20 counties that I represent every quarter, and I will continue to do that next year. I think that's my job, is to represent those people who elected me in Iowa's first district to do this job. And so I'll continue to do that. Obviously, the campaign is a completely separate, I'm here in my official capacity, so I don't want to delve too much into campaign right now, and there'll be a time and a place to talk about that, but ultimately, I'm going to continue to serve the people that I am elected to represent in all 20 of those counties.
So this isn't necessarily a forward campaign question, because there's a time and a place for that, but when you were elected, in at least one of the debates that I watched, you had said that, yeah, I'm not here to do this for the rest of my life. That I'm here to serve the people of Iowa, but it's not a long-term thing. So I'm curious, what does that look like, and what are your aspirations?
Yeah. Well, I've been in office 10 months, and at least the congressional office for 10 months, and my mom actually, we were talking about this about 2 weeks ago. It was Black Friday in 2015 was when I left my job as a news anchor. That was my last day on the air. So I would never have envisioned that I would be here in 5-6 years later, right? So I mean, it's one of those things where I didn't think that this is where my life would even take me. So I don't want to be a crystal ball in terms of what my next step is, but I know that I'm going to do as much as I can while I'm currently in office. I don't know what next year looks like, and I don't know what 6 years from now looks like, but I can tell you that my main job is to try to make sure that I'm protecting what I think are important values for Iowa, which is the future of this country. Right now, I see two diverging paths, and to me, standing up against that is my most important job right now. I see a path where this spending and complete disrespect for taxpayers is taking us in one direction, and that's not what I'm hearing from Iowans that they want. So right now, my focus is on that. I'm 38 years old. I'm, again, never expected to even be doing this job. So I will, again, stand by what I said. I don't want to be doing this for the rest of my life. My husband, I think, expects me to retire and be with him at some point, let alone be home. And, obviously I try and make sure I'm home as much as I can. And I have children to raise, so whatever's right for my family will be my path.
So two of the biggest things that we hear in our business community are things that every business community is hearing right now. I can't get inventory.
Mm-hmm.
And when I do have inventory, I don't have people to put it on my floor or to sell it. I can't find workers, and I can't find merchandise.
Mm-hmm.
How is this going to get solved, and when is it going to get solved?
Well, I think the thing I would point to is the work that I'm trying to do to help, number one, shine light on these problems, but also number two, come up with policy solutions. So first, in the district, I would point to a meeting that I took with Oak Street Manufacturing, where they have seen a huge increase in shipping container costs. They used to pay about $4,000 for a shipping container, and now they're paying $29,500 as of about a month, 6 weeks ago maybe. That's incredible when you look at the inflation that is costing them. They've had to raise their prices more in the last year than they did in the previous 25 years combined, and now we just got the results, obviously, of the inflation numbers, highest in more than 30 years in October. That is concerning, and I think that the inflation in this country is caused by two things, and I've had conversations with the Fed, I've had conversations with, labor department folks. It's twofold. It's workforce, and it's infusion of cash into the economy. So number one, I serve on the Jobs and Economy Task Force. It's a Republican-led initiative, and I am chairing the 21st Century Workforce Working Group on that. We actually have our first meeting next month. We've already been brainstorming ideas, though, that we're going to try to put into place in policy solutions. Look for those probably in the spring. So that working group is actively meeting right now. We're trying to figure out, is it worker education? One of my colleagues said, don't call it training, call it education, because dogs are trained, people are educated. I think that's a very interesting change in how you think about it, but so we're looking at policies. I supported one to expand Pell Grant opportunities for training programs that are, for instance, 8-week training programs as opposed to full college training programs, education programs, we should say. I think those kinds of solutions are ways where we can scale up people more quickly to have the skills that workers or employers say they need. I do think that we've been, with the enhanced unemployment benefits, we've seen a shift in how many people are choosing to live their lives on income, in terms of income. And I do think that there has been a huge infusion of cash from the federal government into many people's livelihoods. So ultimately, I think we need to make sure people are able to get back to work and that the government doesn't continue to pay people to stay home. We're seeing proposals from people like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, to continue those enhanced unemployment benefits right now. That's the wrong direction to take our country. So I introduced the Back to Work Act, which would actually take a look at all of the unemployment programs. Are they effective? Where's the fraud in those programs, so we're not being wasteful? Because there was, I think the number was over $80 billion in terms of fraud with those enhanced programs. So I think that's one aspect. And then we have to stop the rampant inflation, because that's torpedoing people's lives and livelihoods. I mean, ultimately, you look at the impact on our businesses, it's affecting their bottom line, and that is something that's a problem. But we're working on some solutions, and I'll be happy to update you when we're ready to go public on all of those.
Well, specific to the unemployment piece, I have to poke at that a little bit. So, I mean, it's hard to imagine our unemployment here getting lower. And you know, we had Governor Reynolds change in June to turn back federal supplements to unemployment, and that didn't really move the needle. I mean, we still, you can't go to Burger King at 6 o'clock because they can't staff it.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
Well,
it's not necessarily a training issue or an education issue there, as much as just getting people in the workforce.
Yeah, well, and I think a lot of what I mentioned with the cash infusion, a lot of families have made changes, right? I've heard this in some of my stops, that people have said, okay, well, we can now make it on one income. We have readjusted our life or scaled back other things, and the pandemic, I do think, changed people's perspectives on life a little bit too. So we're competing with that as well in terms of getting people back into the workforce. Childcare was a huge issue for a lot of families, working families, during the pandemic, and I've heard, I did a Zoom meeting with the Cedar Rapids Area Metro Economic Alliance. They brought on HR managers from several companies, and all of them said, we've had a she session because women had to leave last year, predominantly women, to go be the child care, obviously for their families and for their kids, and the educators for their kids in many cases. And so they haven't seen that bounce back yet. And I think that's a huge challenge, and the child care aspect is huge. So one of the things that our working group is working on is how do we maybe incentivize child care options that are not your traditional working hours, or things that would, you know, provide more flexibility for families around, you know, because like the daycare model that I was a part of, 6:30 in the morning you could drop them off and you had to pick them up by 6 at night. That was just the hours. Many jobs are outside of those hours, right? So trying to incentivize on-site daycare or education options for kids.
So that could be federal legislation, you think?
Yeah. So we're working on those are some of the top line ideas. We don't have all the specifics worked out yet, but that's some of the direction that we're starting to go with our conversations.
I think the Wall Street Journal, our local economic development official, all documented that the worker shortage was actually upon us before the pandemic, and this just made it worse. And you know, with people leaving the workforce, and you have early retirements and so on. So I guess you know, in addition to, you know, child care and getting what used to be working moms back to work, and that is absolutely one of the areas. What other solutions do you have in mind that could help? And also, I guess I would say is, given the fact that we are on a path of unsustainability from a workforce standpoint before the pandemic, many people would suggest that we have got to figure out our immigration solution. And so I know you mentioned work visas and stuff like that, but what would be a way that you and or the Republican Party would support broader immigration to be able to bring people into the workforce going forward?
Yeah, well, I think first and foremost, I think what I talked about earlier with the two-part solution, right? Secure the border first and foremost, but also make sure we're incentivizing legal immigration. So the employers that I'm talking to are looking for flexibility in, let's say, you know, a lot of these programs are designed for ag workers only, for temporary workers. We need to make sure that they're more accessible. One of the pieces of legislation that I supported would have made it easier for repeat returning workers to come in again, easing that burden on employers. Another immigration policy that I actually just met with a group at the Capitol last week, but they're kids of people who've come to this country, right? So now they're facing this, they're facing a cliff where they can't work, number one, because of their status. So you have literally the best and the brightest. Their parents have come here, they're doctors, they're dentists, they're nurses, they're, engineers, and their kids came here at age 5 or young, and now they're facing that 21-year-old birthday and being kicked out of our country. So I'm a co-sponsor on legislation that would fix that loophole for those kids, enabling them to get into the workforce and stay here legally in the right way. So I think where the biggest challenge I see is on both sides. You've got build the wall, deport them all, and I believe in building the wall and making sure we're secure, but I also don't believe in let's open the border and have full amnesty for everyone. So it's really coming up with those solutions that can help with the workforce challenges at the same time, and that's what I've chosen to support.
Actually, you talked about some of the bipartisanship that exists, and we often don't hear about that. And I think we're all well aware of kind of the political climate. It seems like among kind of the regular folk in our area and in our nation. Where does social media fit into all this? Both, in terms of the role that it has played when it comes to politics, but also you yourself and the way that you use social media. Do you feel like you're highlighting those connections, or that we're highlighting the things that are, kind of tearing us apart?
I think there's a balance to be had there, obviously, in terms of being critical of policies you don't agree with while still highlighting the good things, and that's
Sure.
what I've tried to do. If you look at my official social media channels, obviously I'm going to be critical when I believe the policies for energy in this country are driving gas prices higher, when I believe that the policies at the border are making our country less safe. But I'm also going to highlight the opportunities that I have to work together and highlight the wins in our community. And that's what I've tried to do in terms of the social media presence that we have. I believe in transparency and accountability, and that's why, again, I'm here. It's why I put out information. It's why I do a newsletter to give context and perspective to the decisions that we are making in Washington, D.C. Because I think oftentimes you look at the environment on social media, it's the context that's missing, and civility in many cases too. So everything that I've tried to do, I believe there is a point in you absolutely should be speaking up and be critical of things you don't agree with, but I think you can do that in a way that's not disrespectful.
Could you point to some, I don't know if anybody here has some examples recently of where you've highlighted kind of those bipartisan successes? Because,
We can get you, if you pop on
we
up, so,
follow
yeah.
it. That's
Yeah.
certainly not the tone that I think we get from your social media perspective.
Absolutely. I'm happy to put together a list. I don't have my
Okay.
Facebook in front of me right
Sure.
now, but
Sure.
happy to put together some posts that I believe highlight exactly what you're
Okay.
saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
When you talk about spending and what do you hear on that front when you're out talking to constituents? Do you think that your constituency is opposed to the infrastructure bill?
I think they're opposed to massive spending in whole, and that's what I think I've heard from folks. I think people are opposed to the spending spigot that's been turned on this year. I've heard that at all 9 of my town halls. And it's very clear to me, Iowans want investments in infrastructure, but they want it in a targeted way. That's why I talked a lot about the targeted things that I've asked for on the Appropriations Committee. And that is the number one thing that I've heard from people, is they are happy to, I just heard it at an event I was at, happy to pay taxes, but we want it spent targeted. And that's the feedback that I have gotten over the district.
And so what would that look like? Would it be, it would be where the federal lawmakers are kind of driving the process in terms of identifying the projects that should be.
Right now, the model it's working for states like Iowa, where money comes into Iowa, and you look at our DOT commission that is deciding what projects are needed here. That model works great for a state like Iowa, and it works great in other states too. And I think that, rather than throwing massive amounts of money and government mandates at problems, we should be targeted in those needs. That's where it's important to have a voice. For instance, I'm on the THUD Appropriations Committee. I think that kind of input is absolutely critical to making sure that resources can be targeted with the finite amount of money that we have. But for the bigger pots of money, I mean, that's where I think it's really, really effective to have it trickle down to your states. States and local, I mean, you look at our county engineers, they know what bridges need fixed.
Sure.
And I think that's a really good model. You know, with what I've heard too, you know, when I look at infrastructure investment, we need to be focusing on roads and bridges and locks and dams. That's why I've supported those projects through community project funding requests and in trying to secure grant dollars as well.
And so your impression or understanding is that in the infrastructure bill as presently proposed, those channels would not be followed?
For me, it was the sum of the parts that was the biggest beef with that bill. It was very clearly those bills were tied together. That bill did include a lot of money for Amtrak, and they just got a huge amount of money in the coronavirus relief packages. So ultimately, for me, it was about pumping the brakes on spending in general right now. We've had a huge amount of spending, $7 trillion in spending this year, and we're on a path that's completely unsustainable. And you know, at some point, it is the taxpayers who pay for all of this. And right now, we're borrowing money that we don't have. Our debt limit has been reached. You know, our credit card is maxed out, and the bill is due. And ultimately, all the Democrats in Congress are focused on right now is continuing to talk about how many trillions of dollars we're spending. That's the wrong approach. And in my mind, letting the representatives, the elected representatives for those districts speak up about projects that are important back home is the way we should be operating.
Okay.
So you talked about, you know, at the beginning, you know, several of the community projects that you had pitched being included in bills. I mean, is that not true of all the other representatives on the appropriations? I mean, was everyone else not also targeted in that sort of way?
I don't know if on the Appropriations Committee, I can't speak to that, but I know not every member participated in those requests. So when I look at being able to get all those requests included, I'm very pleased that collegiality existed and my colleagues respected my requests enough to see them as being important enough to fund in those bills.
Right. I guess I'm wondering if you need, like, for you to have supported, you know, the infrastructure, would it have taken like a line item, like a project list I mean, would that have?
No, for me, it was about, you know, you look at about half that bill was existing authorizations, and that I think is, you know, that was really good, and I think most people would have supported that. It's this dramatic expansion combined with the reconciliation package, combined with, for me, it's more about hitting pause on all of this, because we are at a point where we do have the rampant inflation, the highest we've seen in 30 years. I had that meeting with the acting director of OMB back when they released the budget back in May. And I asked them specifically, have you accounted for inflation in any of your budget projections? And they had not. And they said at the time it was probably going to be transitory, and that's why they didn't. And now it's very clearly 6 months later, we've been sounding the alarm on this for months, and I'm saying, hey, hold up, we can't keep spending like this, we don't have the money. So ultimately, being targeted is the best way to be as efficient as possible within the confines of where we're working. And so that's what I would like us to get back to. We need to pass these appropriations bills. And I'm hopeful that we'll still be able to do that before the end of the year, because that's responsible. But at the same time, I think we also need to go back to the drawing board, because again, many of these bills are being passed without pay-fors. Many of these bills are being passed without CBO office estimates, or being, you know, proposed without true estimates of how much they're going to cost. And I think that should be the bare minimum of responsible governing, is to know how much we're spending and why.
I just want to flag we have time for about one more question before we have to head out.
Yep, I was just gonna say that. Anybody wanna have a last thing they wanna get in here?
Yeah, I do.
Burning question, for the end.
So, I know you've talked about some bipartisan work that you've done. And when you look at our country and our state, there's a lot of division. And you look at Congress, and I think that the number I heard last week is 12% approval. And I know it's always very, very low, but you see Schumer or Pelosi or McCartney, or I'm sorry, McCarthy, or
We can maybe do some Beatles music and.
Paul, or
Did he
McConnell,
run? I don't-
and I mean, it is just short of using the word, I hate those people. And how can citizens of the country not be divided when everything they see is so divided? And even your own party, 13 people voted for the infrastructure bill, and there are Republicans saying, well, they better get their retirement plans figured out because they're out of here. I just don't understand how you can continue to portray, and I don't mean you specifically,
Yeah.
but Washington can continue to portray being so divided and then question why the country is so divided.
Well, what I would say is that I have tried to operate in this district as the representative for this district in a way where I hope people have more than a 12% approval rating for me. I think what you find is that maybe Congress as a whole has that 12% approval rating, but people like their member of Congress, and that's I think where the country is right now. I think ultimately it comes down to we have to do better. I mean, we have to be more civil, and we have to try to operate that way as much as possible. And we are in a divided country right now. But ultimately, I think it also comes down to people need to come to center and realize when the policies that they're continuing to double down on are continuing to divide. And that is where I think Congress is right now. It's at that precipice of, as I mentioned, those two diverging points. So I don't know what the full answer is. I know that I've tried to operate in a way where the people of this district know I'm going to be their advocate and I'm going to stand up for them. And that, in my mind, is the best way I can serve the people here, even in a dysfunctional and chaotic place like Washington.
I mean, I even see like on the Senate side, people like Manchin and Sinema, how they can't go walking through the airport because
She can't go to the bathroom by herself.
exactly, because
yeah.
they're getting attacked because that's really the marching orders they're seeing in Washington.
Yeah, well, and I think that there is no place for that kind of, I mean, it's one thing to be speaking up about what you believe in, and I absolutely believe people have the right to do that, and whether we agree or not, and I always have said, if I disagree with you, try and change my mind, let's have that conversation, but I think there's no place for that kind of stalking rhetoric, that kind of inflammatory rhetoric is what's wrong with the country, and unfortunately, social media fans the flames on a lot of those things, right? Those videos go viral in moments, and then that helps, continue that push negatively toward either side. And so I think the only thing I can say is, people have to do better, and we have to operate differently, and I hope I'm leading by example on that front.
Just a quick follow-up on this. I wonder, I mean, so often from Republicans, even in policy decisions, we see the word socialism thrown around frequently, and I wonder if there is any hyperbole to using that word, and also how one expects to use that word when an entire generation of people spent their entire lives being warned away from that term. I wonder how you can use that at the same
Well,
time.
for me, it's pretty clear. Increased dependence on government is a slippery slope, and that's a slope towards socialism. And I have colleagues who have run from socialism that are members of our Republican conference. And I've had a number of conversations with them. Point to two specifically, Carlos Jimenez in Miami and Maria Salazar. They both know what it's like. They've fled communist Cuba, their families have, and they serve a lot of those people who have experienced that firsthand, as well as when you look at that slope and what they fled, they see what's happening here. So I don't think it's a stretch. I think it's a reality for what we're seeing proposed in these packages that in some of these countries where it has happened, it's happened very quickly. And I've heard it loud and clear from Iowans that that's not the direction that they want to go. So that's why I'm speaking up against those policies that I think veer us toward that direction.
All right, we better call it
Yeah.
there, so
Okay.
I just want to thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for joining
Yes,
us.
thank
It
you
was
very
really
much.
great.
Yep.
And covered a
We'll
lot of
follow up
ground.
on whatever we need
Sounds
to,
great.
and appreciate you hearing me out.
Yeah.